Paul Vario held court in two places that fit him perfectly. One was Gefkin's on Flatlands Avenue, an old German bar in South Brooklyn where he could sit outside on warm days, play chess, drink, and see the same neighborhood faces who had known him for years. The other was the trailer at Bargain Auto Parts on Avenue D in Canarsie, inside a junkyard full of scrap, old parts, and the kind of privacy a man like Vario valued. He liked antique cars, kept a favorite red and white 1957 Chevrolet for Sunday use, and preferred places where he could talk business without using a telephone. Local police came by, paid their respects, took favors, and sometimes left with gratuities or deals on parts. That was the world around him. Old Brooklyn, old habits, old protection, and a man who felt safest where he controlled the room. There was another side to him that sat beside the street side. He had only 2 years of high school, but he read legal and medical writing, listened to opera, and told younger men to become professionals. That did not erase what he had been or what he had done. In 1937, when he was still a young man, he and Anthony Romano were convicted in the rape of a 16-year-old girl from Howard Beach after a church function. A witness had to come into court under police protection after saying threats had been made against her if she testified honestly. Vario was sentenced to 10 to 20 years, paroled more than once, and returned to prison more than once for violations before finally clearing state parole in 1962. Once he was free for good, he went back to what he understood. He took over gambling territory after the death of Jake Colombo, moved into Island Park in Nassau County, and kept a close watch on Long Island action while expanding again in Brooklyn. By 1965, he was one of the men arrested in a multi-million-dollar gambling case tied to an undercover Suffolk County sergeant named Everett Holzer. In 1966, Nassau County hit him again in a large bookmaking case, and newspapers were already describing him as the leading force in the ring. Stephen DePasquale was indicted with him and identified as a Lucchese soldier, another sign of where Vario was sitting in the family by then. Each arrest raised his profile, and each new case pushed the state and the IRS closer to the money behind his operations. The gambling cases were only one part of the pressure building around him. Another line of trouble came from police corruption in Brooklyn after the fallout from Frank Sacco and the Knapp Commission. Deputy Commissioner William McCarthy had become disgusted with how compromised the plainclothes vice squads were, so he reorganized them and gave them fresh targets. One of those targets became Gefkin's. Detectives noticed the regular movement in and out of the bar, saw Vario and his circle using it as a meeting place, and heard enough talk around the payphone to suspect sports betting. Charles Hines from the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office joined the effort, and the investigation moved from watching faces to tapping lines. The first wiretap went onto the Gefkin's telephone. That led investigators to another number at the junkyard in Canarsie, and soon the phone there was tapped too. Those taps confirmed betting talk, but they still did not explain why major mob figures from other families kept visiting the trailer at Bargain Auto. So the investigation widened again. Hines and the detectives borrowed space across the street from Nazareth High School and began recording who came and went. They wanted the conversations inside the trailer, not just the visitors. That meant getting past a night watchman, razor wire, a German shepherd, and a Doberman pinscher. They got in because the watchman had a routine. Every night around 9, he went off for dinner, had a sandwich, a shot of vodka, and a beer, and stayed away long enough to open a narrow window for the technicians. Henry Sobel, a prosecutor who also knew dogs, helped deal with the animals by using meat laced with tranquilizer. Once the yard was quiet and the watchman was gone, the technicians slipped into the trailer and hid a listening device in the ceiling over Vario's desk. That bug stayed in place for months, while Vario brought in associates, met visitors, and went on doing business as if the room was still private. At the same time, an undercover detective, Doug Levien Jr., posed as a crooked cop willing to sell information and took money in the trailer while the device listened overhead. The amount of surveillance gathered in that case was huge. Investigators ended up with taped conversations, thousands of feet of color film, tens of thousands of still photographs, and a long list of visitors tied to organized crime. When Brooklyn District Attorney Eugene Gold unveiled the case in October 1972, he walked the press into the trailer and showed them the hidden device in the ceiling. More than 1,200 officers spread across the city and the surrounding counties to serve subpoenas and pull people in. Gold described what he had built as something larger than the public had seen before from a city prosecutor. Whether or not every target was as important as the headlines suggested, the effect on Vario was immediate. He was no longer just another local bookmaker with cops in his pocket. He was a public focus in a major organized crime case. At that point, federal pressure on the mafia was still weaker than later years would make people believe. J. Edgar Hoover had never made mob investigations a real priority, and even after his death, the FBI was still spending too much time stacking smaller gambling cases instead of driving at the actual leadership of the five families. The strike force approach was also producing many cases that ended with minor convictions and light results. That left room for Gold to dominate the headlines, and he used it. He had already charged dozens of mob figures in other actions, and now came after Vario, some police officers tied to him, and the business conducted around the trailer and Gefkins. The case did not destroy the mafia, but it put Vario under a level of public and legal scrutiny he had not faced before. Part of what came out of the surveillance was the extent of the police help available to him. One lieutenant, Meyer Rubenstein, was heard blurting out that he thought the phones were tapped. More than 100 officers were looked at for their visits to the junkyard and their suspected favors. Detectives John Cuomo and Ralph Caccia were indicted in one branch of the case, and Caccia was accused of asking for a payoff while sitting inside the trailer itself. The deeper point was simple. Vario had long relied on a cushion of corrupted local law enforcement, and Burke benefited from that same world. Officers could steer abandoned cars toward the junkyard, tip off targets, or help keep attention away from the wrong places. That system did not protect everyone forever, but for years it had given Vario room to move. The same case also exposed personal trouble was landing on him all at once. He had already done 9 months in 1970 on contempt charges during a running battle with Nassau District Attorney William Kahn. He was facing tax pressure, hijacking pressure, insurance fraud allegations, witness tampering allegations, and bribery charges tied to the money Levien received while posing as a crooked cop. His marriage was breaking apart. He was out of the Deer Park home and living next to Gefkins. When detectives came to arrest him in one of the gold bug matters, he led them on a car chase through Brooklyn before they caught him. Even when he was under heavy pressure, he still acted like a man who believed he might outrun the next problem. Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill were dragged into serious trouble at the same time, and it did not begin with some giant underworld move. It began in Tampa during a trip paid for by a culinary union tied to JFK. Burke, Hill, and Casey Rosato ended up in an argument with John Siaco over money. The argument turned physical. Burke grabbed Siaco and Hill, beat him with a revolver before the matter was supposedly settled. They cleaned him up, kept going, and treated the whole thing like a routine problem. Then the case reopened because Siaco's sister worked as a typist for the FBI in Tampa and reported what she saw. With witnesses available, the Bureau built an extortion case, had Burke and Hill arrested in New York, and got convictions in November 1972. Both men received 10-year prison terms, though they remained free while appealing. The criminal life did not stop while those appeals moved through the courts. Burke and Hill went back to Robert's Lounge, the suite, stolen goods, credit card schemes, and the everyday business that had already become normal for them. but law enforcement now believed it finally had momentum. Newspapers were writing that the mafia was under pressure in a way it had not been in years. One December 1972 report even described the idea that Carlo Gambino wanted to tighten the 5 families into a more disciplined structure because the existing groups had become sloppy, weakened, and crowded with younger men who created risk. Whether that scheme was real or not, the concerns behind it were real enough. Thomas Lucchese, Joseph Profaci, and Vito Genovese were gone. The Lucchese side had been hit hard by the gold bug fallout. And men like Vario were showing that even caution could fail when the wrong investigators got close enough. By 1973, the pressure on Vario reached federal taxes. Prosecutors accused him and Stephen de Pasquale of hiding gambling income from a Queen's numbers operation in 1965 and 1966. Undercover agents had worked their way into that business as runners and helpers, and other participants testified too. Vario took the stand, denied key claims, and tried to explain away an earlier gambling plea as something done only because of a deal arranged by his lawyer. The jury did not accept it. He was convicted of tax evasion, fined, and sent to Lewisburg. That prison term changed the next stage of the story, because Lewisburg turned into a place where Vario, Johnny Dio, Vinnie Alloy, Henry Hill, and other organized crime figures were all living inside a distorted version of normal mob life. Lewisburg was prison, but not in the ordinary way. Favored inmates had food, drink, special rooms, and cooking setups smuggled in with help from guards. Vario barely had to enter the regular mess. The men around him cut deals, ate well, and kept a social order that looked familiar to them. Burke served elsewhere for a time, but Vario and Hill were in the same larger prison world, while appeals and other cases continued outside. Vario also kept fighting. In one branch of the gold bug case, his lawyer Joel Winograd attacked the proof tied to the alleged Levian bribe, arguing that the state had never properly connected the cash to Vario. The appellate court overturned that conviction. Vario celebrated at Gefkin's when the decision came down, and for one more moment avoided another term. When 1978 arrived, Vario, Hill, and Burke were back on or near the street, but the world around them had changed. Thomas Lee was dead. Carmine Tramunti had been removed by a heroin conviction and died in prison in October 1978. Carlo Gambino was gone, replaced by Paul Castellano. Carmine Galante was pushing hard on the Bonanno side, while Rastelli still had support behind him. Frank Thierry was the acting boss of the Genovese family. Vincent Alloy stood at the head of a weakened Colombo family after Joe Colombo's collapse and death. Vario was older now, in his 60s, still important, still earning, but forced to move more carefully. Burke was supposed to be adjusting to legitimate life through a halfway house routine. Hill came out of prison determined to make back the money he had missed while inside, and went straight toward drug dealing. They were all hungry for a score, and the score that began to take shape did not start with Vario or Burke. It started with Louis Werner, a Lufthansa cargo employee at JFK, who was already compromised by gambling debts, child support trouble, and a private life that was falling apart. Years earlier, he had already stolen a bag of international currency that came in on a flight from Quito, then moved the cash through friends instead of being caught. He kept his job, even after suspicion fell on him. By the late 1970s, he knew the secure room, the alarm system, the paperwork, and the flow of high-value cargo through Warehouse 261. He also knew that diamonds, gold, and foreign currency passed through that room regularly. He wanted a much bigger score, and he needed help. His friend Peter Grunwald began floating the idea in bars around the airport, especially at the Owl Tavern on New York Boulevard. In early August 1978, he began sounding out Brian Weremachik and his friends, first with loose talk and then with real proof. He arrived in a Lufthansa uniform with an attaché case, showed a cargo manifest listing gold and diamonds, and went over plans for taking the valuables room on a Sunday night into Monday morning, when staffing was light and the right people could be tied up and controlled. Labor Day was mentioned, then Columbus Day. Grunwald even had a schematic of the building and believed the secure room could be entered without setting off the alarm because Werner knew how the system worked. The plan called for at least 5 men and enough vehicle space to carry away up to 140 boxes. But those first plans did not go forward. Weremechik had other obligations. One of the men involved thought Grunwald was rushing the job. The holidays passed. Werner kept feeling the pressure from his bookie and from the rest of the bills eating into a salary that could never cover his life. Grunwald became frustrated, then dismissive, and eventually waved Weremechik and his friends away. Just after Thanksgiving 1978, the version of the big Lufthansa score they had all talked about was finished before it started. The idea was still alive, the weakness inside Lufthansa was still there, and the need for money had not gone anywhere. But that early attempt was dead, and the men who would later turn the heist into history had not yet fully stepped into place. Late in 1978, a few weeks before Lufthansa, Paul Vario sat down at a McDonald's on Rockaway Boulevard with FBI agent Robert Levinson and his lawyer Joel Winograd. Levinson told him the Bureau believed his life could be in danger. The warning was not random. Vario's name had already been tied to the gold bug fallout, and there were men in that world who could blame him for bringing heat down on too many people. The conversation was also an attempt to frighten him into changing sides. Vario heard it out, thanked Levinson, got up, and walked away without giving the FBI anything. The warning was serious enough, even if no one could say exactly how close the danger really was. Men had been subpoenaed, harassed, and in some cases arrested after the hidden listening device in Vario's junkyard office began producing results. Some people in that life may have thought he had failed to protect them. Others may simply have decided he had become careless. Vario did not open the door for the investigators himself, but from the street view, the result was the same. The junkyard had been penetrated, conversations had been heard, and too many names had been pulled into the light. Then the killings around Lufthansa started moving faster. Parnell Edwards had one simple responsibility after the robbery: get rid of the black van. Instead, he left it out on a street where an NYPD officer ticketed it and where police later connected it to the robbery. Prints were lifted. Other physical evidence was recovered from inside. Edwards made it worse by talking too loosely at a Christmas gathering connected to Burke's Circle, where he complained that the white guys had made so much money from the airport and should throw him some of it. Henry Hill later said Paul Vario heard that, got red in the face, and decided Edwards had to go. Within a day of that order, Edwards was dead in his apartment in Ozone Park, shot repeatedly. Hill later placed Tommy D. Simone inside that killing, with Angelo Sepe outside. Burke even helped with funeral expenses afterward. A man could be marked for death, killed almost immediately, and then still be given the appearance of ordinary respect once the job was done. Lufthansa had made everyone around the crew more nervous, and Edwards was the first clear example of what happened when somebody became a direct problem. Tommy D. Simone was already in danger for separate reasons. He had killed Billy Batts, a Maid Gambino member, and he had also killed Foxy Giroth, a man close to John Gotti. Those were not the kinds of acts that could be brushed away by excuses or neighborhood loyalty. In early January 1979, agents even placed a tracking device under Desame's car near Burke's home in Howard Beach, hoping it might lead them somewhere useful. Then the signal went dead. The car vanished, and Tommy vanished with it. Just before he disappeared, Tommy had turned up at Robert's lounge, boasting that he was about to be straightened out and made a captain. Men who heard him say it knew the talk made no sense. A man was not brought into the family and promoted that same day, and people around the bar understood that immediately. Henry later said, Tommy first got a one-day delay because of weather, then was taken to what he believed was an initiation meeting and never came back. Burke called around trying to learn whether Tommy had in fact been inducted, and eventually got the answer he did not want. DeSimone was gone for good, and his body was never found. The likely reason was not Lufthansa, but the older blood on him. The strongest reading from investigators later on was that the Lucchese side, with Vario's help, carried out the killing as a favor to the Gambino family, then led by Paul Castellano. Even so, Tommy's disappearance landed right in the Lufthansa aftermath and widened the fear around the crew. Now Edwards was dead, Tommy was gone, and anyone near the robbery had another reason to think survival depended on keeping quiet and staying useful. Martin Krugman did not manage either of those things. He had been the link between Louis Werner's inside knowledge and Burke's crew, but he was also cheap, persistent, and never fully trusted around Robert's lounge. He had even once threatened to go to the district attorney after one of his employees was beaten up. After the robbery, he kept hanging around Vincent DeSaro's club on Rockaway Boulevard, asking about money and pressing for his share. Burke talked about killing him, pulled back, and then in early January 1979, Krugman disappeared. Hill later recalled walking into DeSaro's place, seeing Burke there, and understanding almost immediately from Burke's response and his hand gesture that Krugman was dead. Krugman's disappearance hurt the investigation as much as it hurt his family. He was one of the clearest human links between Werner and the men around Burke. Instead of becoming a witness, he vanished. That left federal prosecutor Edward MacDonald with a harder job. MacDonald was part of the Brooklyn strike force under Thomas Puccio, and once federal authorities took control of the Lufthansa case, away from Queens District Attorney John Santucci, MacDonald became one of the central prosecutors driving it. What began as a huge airport robbery case quickly turned into a wider organized crime problem involving the 5 families, the FBI, and a strike force that wanted more than just one airport conviction. From early on, agents were hearing that Burke and his crew were involved, but proving it was another matter. The Lufthansa workers could not identify most of the robbers from photos. Kerry Whalen, the employee who had been pistol whipped, only said that Angelo Sepe resembled one of the men. Informants said Sepe was talking about the score and that he had kicked about $20,000 upward to Alphonse Persico of the Colombo family. Agents put a bug in Sepe's car and tried to make it work, but Sepe constantly had music playing, and the recordings came through badly. To get usable reception, the FBI had to trail his car with specialized equipment and even use an aircraft overhead. The effort produced scraps, not enough for a robbery warrant. The easier opening came from Louis Werner, because Werner could not stop talking. He mentioned the heist to his estranged wife, to his girlfriend Janet Barbieri, and to Bill Fischetti. He even talked about investing money in a cab business. Investigators learned that pattern and began pressing him harder. They also tried to stir up conversations among the robbers by feeding selected information outward and hoping wiretaps or bugs would catch the reaction. At the same time, MacDonald tried another route by grabbing Sepe on a parole violation tied to an unauthorized Florida trip, hoping Burke would panic and think Sepe might cooperate. Agents searched Sepe's home, found nothing, and the charge was eventually dismissed. Sepe stayed in place. Peter Grunewald gave the prosecutors more to work with. He had been around the earliest Lufthansa planning and had helped shape the first version of the idea before Werner cut him out. In February 1979, the FBI took him in on a material witness warrant. Grunewald started cooperating and said Werner had admitted being part of the robbery and had earlier worked with him on the plan. He also said Werner paid him $10,000 to keep quiet. That gave MacDonald the next step. Werner was arrested, brought into the federal office in Brooklyn, and confronted face-to-face with Grunewald. Werner turned pale and looked shaken, but he still would not fold. He denied enough to keep the case alive for trial and forced the government to move forward. The indictment added another problem for Werner by reviving the 1976 theft of foreign currency from the Lufthansa cargo building. This time, Grunewald and Bill Fischetti could help fill in the missing pieces. Werner could not make bail and sat in custody while his daughter, Diane, was badly hurt in a California car crash. The court let him travel west with FBI escorts to see her in the hospital. After the visit, one of the agents asked how he expected to beat the case. Werner replied that he was innocent, then gave away more than he meant to when he said he had never claimed total non-involvement. It was the kind of answer that fit him perfectly. He was not built for discipline, and that is why the government got farther with him than with most of Burke's people. While Werner moved toward trial, Henry Hill was making his own trouble worse. He had stayed off the actual Lufthansa robbery run because he had only recently gotten out of prison and wanted distance from the direct action. But he was deeply involved in narcotics after his release, moving mainly cocaine and some heroin to make money quickly. Vario did not appear to tolerate drug dealing the way some others did, and Hill knew that if Vario learned the full truth, it could end very badly for him. In 1980, a 19-year-old Long Island dealer named Bobby Germain Jr. got caught in a strong Quaalude case and turned informant. He gave Nassau detectives a way into Hill's drug operation, which led to wiretaps, surveillance, and Hill's arrest in April 1980. By then, federal prosecutors understood they had someone in custody who was close to Burke, close to Vario's world, and close to the Lufthansa story at the very moment many other possible witnesses were already dead or missing. The body count around Burke kept rising while that pressure built. Paolo Licastri was found dead in a field in South Brooklyn. Teresa Ferrara, a young Long Island hairdresser who had lived in DeSimone's mother's house and was rumored to have been close to Tommy, disappeared after getting a call at work and saying she might be making an easy $10,000. She never came back. Months later, a torso found in Barnegat Bay was identified as hers. No one could prove that her death came directly from the Lufthansa case, but she was another person standing too near men who were already vanishing. Joanne Kafora, wife of Louis Kafora, disappeared too, while police suspected her husband was laundering part of the Lufthansa money through parking lot businesses. By then, the robbery was no longer just an airport theft. It had turned into a chain of killings, disappearances, and collapsing loyalties that kept removing people who knew too much. Once the Lufthansa robbery was over, the killing did not stop with Stax Edwards, Marty Krugman, and Tommy DeSimone. Louis Kafora and his wife Joanna vanished after Louis started showing signs of new money, including a flashy Cadillac that drew attention at exactly the wrong time. Teresa Ferrara disappeared. Paolo Licastri disappeared. Joe Buddha Manry was gone. Robert Frenchy McMahon was gone. By then, the men closest to the robbery were dropping one after another, and everyone around Burke understood what was happening. The score had turned into a cleanup operation, and anyone who knew too much, talked too much, spent too much, or simply stood too close to the wrong men could disappear. One killing from that period shows Burke's way of handling a business grievance as clearly as anything else. In December of 1978, less than a month after Lufthansa, Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill bought 33 pounds of cocaine. The quality was poor for New York, so Burke and Hill took the load back to Florida and moved it to Richard Eaton and two other drug dealers for a large sum. Some money came back, but not all of it. Jimmy was still owed a substantial balance, and Eaton had become another man who was now on the wrong side of a debt with the wrong people. On February 17, 1979, Hill later recalled Jimmy saying he had gotten rid of Eaton. The next day, police in Brooklyn were sent to a vacant lot at Drew and Blake Streets, where a trailer stood with a lock on it. When the lock was cut and the trailer was opened, Richard Eaton's body was found rolled in a blanket. His feet were tied. Rope was around his neck. An autopsy first concluded that he had frozen to death. Later evidence and later testimony pushed the case in a harsher direction, that Eaton had already been overpowered and left in the cold after Burke settled the matter his own way. The frozen ground had even made burial difficult, so the body was left in the trailer instead. That killing sat heavily in Hill's mind by the spring of 1980. He had already seen what happened to men around Lufthansa. He knew how Burke handled debts, suspicion, and risk. Then came Hill's own Nassau County drug arrest. After making bail, he sat down with Jimmy in a Long Island diner to talk about the informant in the drug case. Jimmy then wanted him to go to Florida to kill Junior Germain. Hill did not hear that as an ordinary assignment. He heard it as the setup before his own murder. By then, he believed the safest direction left was toward the government. Ed McDonald helped force that choice into the open. Henry Hill was arrested as a material witness in the Lufthansa matter after McDonald finally got the warrant approved through Judge Mark Costantino. That moved Hill fully into federal hands. He was told in plain terms that he could face the drug case or cooperate and help break what remained of Lufthansa. On May 27, 1980, he signed the cooperation agreement. In return for telling what he knew, including narcotics trafficking and other crimes, he would not be prosecuted for those admissions. He and his family would be placed into witness protection. If he lied, he could be charged with perjury. That signature ended one life and started another. Even then, the government did not get everything it wanted from Lufthansa. Burke had already benefited from the deaths of too many men who could have confirmed the planning. Louis Werner knew only the inside of the target and the men who first touched him. Angelo Sepe had slipped a previous effort to pin him down and had only taken a short prison term for violating parole by associating with Burke. Some investigators felt Hill knew less about Lufthansa than he claimed. McDonald himself had a heavy load of other mafia work by 1980 and began to see Lufthansa as a case that might never yield the clean conspiracy prosecution he originally wanted. Then Hill gave him something else. A woman tied to Hill's Nassau County case, Judith Wicks, mentioned Boston. McDonald followed the lead, brought Hill in, and heard that Hill and Burke had been involved in fixing Boston College basketball games during the 1978 to 1979 season. That took the case in a new direction. Men from the Pittsburgh side had already linked up with Hill and Burke, and Hill had gone to Boston to help draw players into the scheme. Rick Kuhn became one of the central names. The goal was not to guarantee who won the games, but to affect the point spread so bookmakers around the country would take losses without understanding why. That operation was not perfect. When Boston College lost to Holy Cross by only 2 points instead of falling outside the expected spread, Burke was said to have lost $50,000 and put his foot through the television set in his Howard Beach home. For a moment he wanted Hill to go back to Boston and punish the players. That never happened. What did happen was a federal case. Hill testified. Other witnesses backed parts of the scheme. Kuhn made admissions. In 1981, a jury convicted Burke and several others. Jimmy got 20 years. Kuhn got 10, later reduced. Burke still was not convicted for Lufthansa itself, but the college fixing case put him away and gave the government the one clean fall it had been unable to get from the airport robbery. Jimmy did not stop trying to reach Henry, even after Henry went into witness protection. Investigators later said Jimmy worked to learn where Hill and his family had been sent. At one point, he got close enough that the marshals had to move Hill and his family quickly out of Omaha and farther west. Hill had protection. Angelo Sepe did not. After resisting pressure to implicate himself in Lufthansa, and after a short return to prison for violating parole, Sepe came back out to a world that no longer trusted him. On July 18, 1979, Sepp and his girlfriend Joanne Lombardo were found shot to death in a basement apartment in Bensonhurst. Both had been shot in the head. Seppe's death removed another surviving Lufthansa figure from the board. By the middle of the 1980s, almost everyone publicly named around Lufthansa was dead or gone except Burke. MacDonald then used Hill in another direction, the air freight and labor racketeering system around Kennedy Airport. That case became known as KENRAC, short for Kennedy Racketeering. At the center of it were the Lucchese interests at the airport, pressure on freight companies, labor peace sold for money, and the influence of Teamster figures such as Harry Davidoff. Hill's testimony was not the clean knockout blow it had been in the Burke cases. Much of it was circumstantial. He spoke about conversations and what he had heard from men around Paul Vario, including Lenny Vario and Frank Manzo, about airport jobs, hirings, firings, and who controlled the place. The government still got what it needed from that pressure. Before the case ever reached a final jury verdict against him, Paul Vario folded. At 73, ailing and under major federal heat, he pleaded guilty in the airport extortion case and received 6 years in federal prison. Hill also hurt him in another case tied to a fake no-show job that had been arranged to satisfy parole requirements after Hill came out of prison in 1978. Vario had helped Hill there too, and Hill later testified that it had all been arranged to create phony employment and phony pay stubs. That conviction and the airport case together finished Vario's freedom. He died in federal custody in Fort Worth in 1988. The man who had once approved the Lufthansa robbery ended up in prison for the rest of his life without ever being convicted for that robbery itself. Burke followed a different path to the same end. The government finally nailed him in 1984 for the Eaton murder. Hill was the witness who tied the killing together from inside the business side, the bad cocaine, the money that was still owed, Burke's anger, and Burke's later remark that Eaton had been taken care of. Prosecutors also built out Eaton's ties to Burke and fought over the medical evidence. One side argued Eaton had been strangled and beaten before being left in the cold. Another side argued the exposure killed him. A jury convicted Burke in February of 1985. He was sentenced to 25 years to life. He fought the conviction, but the appeals failed. The man who had escaped a Lufthansa murder case did not escape Richard Eaton. Burke died in prison in April of 1996. By then, his son Frank had been killed too. Stories kept moving for years about where the Lufthansa money had gone. One line held that Burke had hidden large sums in safe deposit boxes and that later men in organized crime burned through what remained. Whether all of that was true or not, one fact stayed clear. Burke was never convicted for Lufthansa, but the robbery destroyed his circle, drove Hill into cooperation, helped bury Vario, and left Burke to die in prison after a separate murder case finally held. The next long aftershock from that world ran through Vincent Asaro. By the 1990s, he was one of the few old Roberts Lounge figures still operating on the street. Burke was in prison. Hill was under federal protection. Most of the others were dead or missing. Asaro, now on the Bonanno side under Joseph Massino, needed money and standing. He had a bad temper, a bad gambling habit, and a strong appetite for whatever steady income he could pull from men beneath him. One of the steadiest sources available was the stolen car and chop shop trade in Queens and Long Island. Guy Gralto became one of the men caught in that system. He ran chop shop operations in Ozone Park and Oceanside, making money from stolen cars, stripped parts, and orders filled piece by piece. Once Asaro came around, demanding protection money, Gralto first resisted. That only brought more violence. Asaro yelled at him, hit him, and made it plain that refusal was not a real option. Gralto finally gave in and started paying weekly protection. In return, no one else was supposed to bother him, and he could work under Bonanno cover. The relationship was ugly but practical, and in that world, practical often lasted longer than pride. When Gralto later tried to shift toward Ronald Trucchio on the Gambino side, Asaro exploded. There had to be talks up the ladder because Trucchio was only a soldier and Asaro was a captain. In the end, Gralto paid a lump sum to get out from under Asaro, shut one operation down and moved. It did not save him. Once he no longer had mob cover, other criminals saw him as easy prey. Martin Bossart and his people abducted him, tortured one of his workers, shot Gralto in the leg, and robbed his home safe while his children were in the house. Trucchio later recovered part of the money and jewels, but the lesson was plain. In that trade, protection money was not abstract. It was part of staying alive and staying in business. By 1995, prosecutors in Queens and the NYPD were ready to move on the stolen car network. After surveillance and wiretaps, Asaro, Gralto, and others were indicted in a multi-million-dollar auto theft case. Gralto pleaded guilty and cooperated. He became the main witness against Asaro and described the payments, the intimidation, and the stolen car system in detail. Asaro caught a break once when a judge dismissed the case, but an appeals court restored it. At retrial in 1998, prosecutors got the conviction they wanted. Asaro was found guilty of enterprise corruption, the state version of racketeering, and received a prison sentence of 4 to 12 years. By then, the old Roberts Lounge world had almost fully changed hands, or disappeared. The Lufthansa generation had not simply aged. It had been killed, imprisoned, turned, or reduced to surviving off whatever remained. To all the subscribers, please unsubscribe then resubscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks. The November air over upstate New York carried the heavy stillness of a season caught between the last breaths of autumn and the coming clamp of winter. A grey light pressing low over the hills and farm roads that wound through Broome County. In this quiet corner of Vestal and Appalachian, where dairy trucks hummed along the rural routes and smoke curled from chimneys of modest family homes, nothing suggested that the most powerful mobsters in the United States were converging on a secluded hilltop estate a few miles outside Binghamton. They were men accustomed to operating in the shadows, men who normally arrived in cities where their presence would blend into the background of immigrant streets and noisy nightclubs, not in an environment of dead-end roads and barely populated industrial outskirts. But on November 14, 1957, the machinery of organized crime, shaken by assassinations, territorial disputes, and the sudden instability left in the wake of Albert Anastasia's murder weeks earlier, was gathering itself to decide the future. Their destination was the estate of Joseph "Joe the Barber" Barbara, a Castellamarese-born bottling plant owner whose country mansion at 625 McFall Road had become a trusted location for confidential get-togethers away from New York City eyes. The stakes of this meeting were immense, and yet the forces that would unravel it had already begun quietly, almost accidentally, a full day before. On the afternoon of November 13th, 1957, Joseph Barbara Jr., 21 years old and recently withdrawn from college to help his father run the Canada Dry bottling plant, was sitting in his office in Endicott when the phone rang. His father's voice instructed him to secure rooms at the nearby Parkway Motel for some friends. The request was routine enough. Barbara Senior often hosted associates and had local rooms arranged for overflow guests. But fate intervened in a way no one present that day could have predicted, for at that same moment, New York State Police Sergeant Edgar D. Croswell was arriving at the same motel, investigating a completely unrelated bad check complaint. Croswell was no ordinary patrol officer. A veteran investigator of the State Police Bureau of Criminal Investigation, he had spent years monitoring the activities of Barbara and his associates, piecing together their patterns, their visitors, their vehicles, and the subtle comings and goings around the bottling plant and the hilltop estate. He had long suspected that Barbara's respectable facade concealed meetings of important underworld figures. When he noticed the young Barbara walking into the Parkway Motel office, he instinctively stepped behind a partition to listen. Croswell later explained the simple reasoning behind his vigilance. "We have checked on his father's activities for many years, and it is just interesting sometimes what you can hear if you step out of sight when someone is around." His instincts were correct. Barbara Jr. booked 3 rooms for November 13th and 14th, charged to the Canada Dry plant, and offered the vague explanation of a Canada Dry convention. The pretext immediately raised red flags. Croswell and Trooper Vincent Vasisco decided to make discreet rounds that evening, checking the plant, and then driving out to Barbara's estate on McFall Road. Dusk had fallen when the officers approached the property. They observed sleek, expensive vehicles, Cadillacs, Lincolns, Pontiacs, parked around the entrance. Running the plates back at the substation, they discovered they belonged to known mob figures: James LaDuca of Buffalo, Alfred Angelicola of New Jersey, and Patsy Turigiano, a barber associate once arrested by Croswell for an illegal still. The match between Barbara's longtime moonshiner connections and these increasingly prominent guests triggered immediate concern. The officers notified 2 colleagues from the U.S. Treasury Department's Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Unit, Kenneth Brown and Arthur Rustin, both of whom had also been monitoring liquor law violators tied to organized crime networks. By 9 p.m., another suspicious vehicle arrived at the Parkway Motel. A blue Cadillac tied to the Buckeye Cigarette Service Company of Cleveland. The occupants refused to register, stating that Mr. Barbara would take care of it. They were, in fact, John Scalish, the Cleveland mafia boss, and his consigliere, John DeMarco. Unaware they were being closely watched, they retired to their rooms. At the Barbara estate itself, activity intensified early the next morning. November 14th dawned grey and overcast, a curtain of cloud hanging low over the hills as the secluded mansion began to fill with arrivals. Joseph Barbara Sr., dressed in a white shirt and dark suit, greeted guests warmly around 8 a.m. as they came down for breakfast. He chatted in Italian, appearing confident, relaxed, and unaware of the surveillance that had begun to form a loose net around the area. By 9 a.m., large American sedans rumbled into the driveway one after another, doors opening to release men from major mafia families scattered across the country. They came from Buffalo, Rochester, New York City, northern New Jersey, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Kansas City, Los Angeles, Dallas, New Orleans, and even Havana. This gathering was not casual, it was historic. The assassinations of the year had destabilized leadership structures in multiple families. Internally, the New York Mafia was in flux. Vito Genovese, fresh from orchestrating the downfall of his rival Anastasia and edging aside Frank Costello earlier in 1957, was consolidating power. His ambitions and the lingering questions over the hits, especially Anastasia's execution in a Manhattan barbershop in October, required approval, arbitration, and recognition by the country's major underworld figures. Such recognition could only happen in person, at a meeting of bosses and high-ranking lieutenants. Genovese reportedly wanted the meeting held in Chicago, but influence, geography, and Barbara's eagerness to host had placed it here in the quiet Catskills-adjacent hamlet. With the leadership crisis unresolved, several informants later revealed the top agenda item: legitimizing the mafia response to Anastasia's killing and finalizing leadership transitions. Inside the house, the meeting had not yet convened formally. Groups of mobsters congregated in the oversized living room with its 7 large sofas. Others gathered in smaller knots in the office, the basement, and the summer house. Outside, near the barbecue pit, fresh steak sandwiches were being prepared by Manny Zakari. Cars continued arriving through mid-morning. John Montana, a Buffalo civic leader and vice figure with a spotless public image, arrived late, apologizing that his car had broken down. Guests helped themselves to cold cuts, fruit, and pastries. While the meeting proper was expected to take place shortly after noon, Multiple men who had flown to the Tri-Cities airport were still being shuttled up the hill by Barbara's men. Spirits were high. The day was unfolding exactly according to plan, until Mrs. Barbara looked out the breakfast nook window close to 12:40 p.m. and saw a strange car creeping up McFall Road. Inside that vehicle were Sergeant Croswell, Trooper Vasisco, and Treasury agents Brown and Ruston, quietly jotting down license plates. In the backyard, barbecue guests spotted the unfamiliar car almost instantly. Dressed in expensive suits and polished shoes, they shifted from casual loitering to quiet alarm. The polished choreography of the meeting abruptly fractured. Croswell and his team backed out and regrouped farther down McFall Road. Sergeant Croswell radioed urgently for reinforcements. He ordered a roadblock at the base of the dead-end street, effectively sealing the only direct exit. In that moment, the operation shifted from surveillance to containment. Inside the house, news of the roadblock spread like a shockwave. The men congregated in tense clusters. Some retreated to rooms, others peered cautiously through windows. Vito Genovese, expecting the day to crown his authority, reacted immediately and skeptically. He insisted he would leave the same way he had come, refusing any suggestion of fleeing through the woods. Other bosses began improvising exits. Engines started up outside. At 1:20 p.m., the first car, a vehicle driven by Emmanuel Zaccari with passenger Dominic Alamo, a Bufalino lieutenant, approached the roadblock. Croswell initially let it pass, then changed course, radioing a nearby unit to intercept it on the highway. Minutes later came a far more critical vehicle, a black 1957 Chrysler Imperial containing Pennsylvania boss Russell Bufalino at the wheel, New York City boss Vito Genovese in the passenger seat, and in the back seat Philadelphia boss Joe Ida, Ida's underboss Dominic Oliveto, and Genovese's underboss Jerry Katina. They were frisked and found unarmed. When asked what they were doing there, Bufalino repeated the refrain that many would use that afternoon, that Barbara was sick and he had brought some friends to visit. Genovese refused to answer questions, asking the troopers bluntly whether he was legally required to. "Well, I would rather not," he concluded, when told he did not have to speak. The roadblock was working, but not fast enough to prevent the chaos now erupting across the estate. Cars kept trying to descend the hill. Some were allowed through if the drivers were locals. Others were stopped immediately. Law enforcement reinforcements expanded the dragnet further outward, spreading through the surrounding woods and nearby dirt roads. 20 troopers fanned out across the area. Back at the house, rumors and panic pushed some guests to attempt escape on foot. Treasury agent Ruston soon observed multiple men sprinting across the backyard toward the woods, dark silhouettes cutting through the open field as clouds thickened and a light drizzle began. The foot chases quickly turned surreal. The first major capture occurred when Agent Brown and Trooper Sackle found John Montana hopelessly tangled in barbed wire, his expensive coat torn and muddy. The arrest stunned those who knew him. Montana was a prominent Buffalo businessman, a civic leader, and had been named the city's Man of the Year in 1956 by a law enforcement fraternal organization. Yet here he was caught in flight from a mafia summit. Nearby stood Antonio Magadino, also muddy and disheveled. Montana attempted to talk his way free, insisting he had stopped by the Barbara home for car repairs en route to Pennsylvania. It did not help his case. Minutes later, Joseph Bonanno and his uncle John Bonventer were caught in a cornfield. Bonanno later attempted to spin an elaborate tale in his memoir, asserting he was not present at the meeting, claiming a bizarre mix-up involving his driver's license being loaned to Gaspar di Gregorio. But at the time, he had been identified not only visually, but also by the social security card he carried. The state police noted he offered a permanent address in Tucson, Arizona, matching Bonanno's move west. His attempt to reframe the event in later decades directly contradicted the documented evidence of the day. Meanwhile, in other parts of the wooded perimeter, additional captures occurred. Treasury Agent Ruston witnessed another group running. Among those eventually caught in the eastern woods were Tampa boss Santos Traficante, who had flown in from Havana that very morning, along with New York Kappa regimes Carmine Lombardozzi and Michelle Miranda. When confronted by troopers after emerging onto McFadden Road, the men ran back into the woods until warning shots forced them to halt. Further north, two DeCavalcanti family mobsters, Fat Frank Mayuri and Fat Lou LaRusso, flagged down a passing motorist named Glenn Craig and pretended to be interested in local land purchases. They even attempted a mock negotiation with Craig before offering him $10 for a ride to Binghamton, but a trooper stopped the vehicle and arrested the men. Their explanation, that they had taken a 7 a.m. train from New Jersey on a spontaneous real estate trip, was swiftly dismissed as implausible. West of the house, bosses from smaller Western families encountered their own humiliations. Frank DeSimone, the Los Angeles boss and an actual licensed attorney, and underboss Simone Scazzari were found near Little Meadows Road. Scazzari carried $600 cash and a personal check for $8,445, equivalent to more than $70,000 today, despite claiming unemployment. Two older bosses, James Black Jim Coletti from Pueblo, Colorado, and Frank Zito from Springfield, Illinois, were found exhausted on the roadside, their clothes matted with debris. Both were first-generation Sicilians who had risen from hard labor in mines to regional mafia leadership. Their presence in the Appalachian woods completed an almost absurd tableau, some of America's most powerful criminal figures reduced to stumbling escapees. Not all escapes ended in capture. In one of the most remarkable mishaps of the day, Kansas City boss Nick Savella and his lieutenant Joseph Filardo, having arrived by train and lacking any getaway vehicle, wandered through the woods to the Appalachian Elementary School. There they asked school staff to call them a taxicab. The bewildered staff notified police. Troopers set up a bulletin describing a blue city cab with two suspicious passengers headed toward Owego. Yet despite the alert, Savella and Filardo remained elusive until, by chance, their cab passed directly in front of the Vestal substation later that afternoon. The stunned officers stopped it immediately. Others came far closer to slipping away entirely. The Cleveland contingent, Scalish and DeMarco, managed to flee the woods and reach their blue Cadillac at the Parkway Motel. With LaDuca and Carlace in the back seat, they drove east toward Route 17. Croswell, realizing the car had not yet been intercepted, ordered troopers to pursue it. They seized it near Binghamton around 4:40 p.m., an almost cinematic end to the long afternoon chase. As the dragnet tightened, a handful of mobsters managed to avoid detection entirely. Detroit boss Joseph Zerilli quietly rented a car at 6 p.m. in Endicott for a one-way drive to Brooklyn. New Orleans Lieutenant Mario Presta and Joseph Marcello, younger brother of New Orleans boss Carlos Marcello, arrived at the Hertz office, soaked and bedraggled, but still free enough to rent a vehicle. And Carmine Galante, who had previously served a 90-day sentence in the Vestal area in 1956, hid so effectively inside the Barbara home that he remained unnoticed until the following morning, when the housekeeper saw two soaked men eating breakfast before leaving discreetly with local ally Emmanuel Zaccari. Galante was later identified from a photograph. He had simply waited out the storm. The captures were staggering in scale. Ultimately, law enforcement confirmed 73 attendees, though eyewitnesses like Barbara's housekeeper recalled between 60 and 70 men, and it is probable that a few more may have slipped away undetected. Contrary to some later mythologizing, no credible evidence ever placed the total at 100 or more. Croswell later estimated that 3 or 4 could possibly have gotten away. No more. By the time troopers escorted the last cars down McFall Road after dusk, the Vestal substation had transformed into a madhouse. The teletype machine clicked continuously, spitting out criminal histories and prison records. Officers hurried between rooms, processing detainees who had been caught either in cars or on foot. Rolls of cash in denominations of $2,000 to $3,000 appeared in pockets, around $16,000 to $24,000 in modern terms, reflecting the cash culture of mafia operations. Questions repeated endlessly. Answers were almost identical. They were visiting a sick friend, Joe Barbara. Not a single attendee admitted to a meeting or acknowledged knowing the broader group present. Their uniform silence held firm. Late that night, Croswell phoned his superiors, asking whether any charges could be filed. No weapons had been found. Disorderly conduct did not apply. Conspiracy charges were impossible without proof of what the men were planning. In the end, nearly every detainee was released without charges. Yet the legal outcome was irrelevant to the true impact. Newspapers received the story before dawn, and by the next morning, headlines across the country shouted the news. Police nabbed 67 mafia chiefs in backwoods. The public, the press, and the political establishment were stunned, the FBI embarrassed, and the mafia leadership shaken to its core. The day that had begun as a consolidation of underworld power had ended as the most catastrophic public exposure in the history of the American Cosa Nostra. The morning after the raid broke over Appalachian like a cold metallic dawn, the kind of pale light that offered no comfort to the men who had spent the previous day sprinting through woods, stumbling over fences, tearing expensive suits, or sitting inside a rural state police substation answering questions they would not dignify with real answers. November 15th, 1957 arrived with the sensation of a storm having passed, but leaving behind a landscape forever changed. The Barber estate stood almost eerily quiet now, its long driveway once filled with Cadillacs and Buicks, reduced to tire impressions in the dirt, and abandoned plates of food in the summer house where 20 pounds of steak had been prepared for a meeting that never truly took place. Inside the home, Mrs. Barbara surveyed the lingering disorder with the stunned detachment of someone who had been thrust into a moment of national significance against her will. Downstairs, officers were still cataloguing items left on tables and chairs, cigarette packs, coats, personal papers, trying to determine which details mattered and which would fade into irrelevance. But for New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell, dawn did not bring clarity or triumph. It brought the enormity of what had occurred and the understanding that the fallout would be greater than anything his team had anticipated. Croswell was a pragmatic investigator, a man who understood that law enforcement often worked in shadows, far removed from the public praise awarded after headline-grabbing arrests. He had monitored Joe Barbara for over 6 years, tracking visitors, scrutinizing license plates, and investigating connections between liquor law violations and organized crime networks stretching across states. But even he admitted afterward that nothing in his career could have prepared him for the implications of what he had accidentally uncovered. There was no question, he later reflected, that these were not ordinary businessmen. He knew many of the names long before he saw the faces: Genovesa, Bonanno, Ida, DeSimone, Buffalino, and he understood that their simultaneous presence at a single location could only signify something unprecedented. The men who had scattered across the woods were not mid-level racketeers or bootleggers. They were, for all intents and purposes, the National Board of Directors of the American Mafia. The news spread faster than any single agency could control. Television stations aired footage of troopers searching the estate. Newspapers printed eyewitness descriptions, criminal histories, and lists of those detained. By mid-morning, rooms in the Vestal substation were overflowing with reporters demanding answers. Cameras flashed as journalists pressed Croswell for comment. Hungry for details, their editors were already heralding as the biggest mafia expose in American history. The public, largely unaware of the scale of organized crime until that moment, reacted with astonishment. Attorney General William Rogers stated that the incident proved there is a national crime syndicate. Even J. Edgar Hoover, who had stubbornly denied the existence of a formalized nationwide mafia for decades, and whose bureau had long downplayed or dismissed local police warnings, could no longer retreat behind skepticism. He responded quickly, but not with gratitude. Instead, he ordered FBI agents to begin collecting reports on those arrested, not to assist Croswell, but to salvage the Bureau's reputation. It was an embarrassing moment for Hoover, who had insisted for years that talk of a national mafia was an exaggeration created by melodramatic journalists and overly ambitious local police. Yet, while the national storyline fixated on Hoover's delayed acknowledgement, the local reality was far more chaotic. Within the state of New York, the immediate pressure fell not on the FBI but on county prosecutors, who now found themselves in possession of dozens of influential crime figures, but with no clear legal violation to charge. None of the men had been caught carrying weapons. Many had been arrested for nothing more than trespassing on private woodland, or simply for being in cars near a roadblock. And despite the presence of bosses and underbosses from nearly every major mafia region, the state had no statutory category for suspected members of a secret criminal organization. Criminal conspiracy laws required proof of an agreement to commit a crime. No one had overheard conversations inside the house. No meeting minutes existed. Still, Broome County District Attorney Warren Green understood the magnitude of the moment, and in the days following the raid, he pursued a strategy rooted in what little the law allowed, charging attendees with conspiracy to obstruct justice, an argument built around the idea that the men had gathered to discuss illegal operations across the United States. It was untested legal ground, but Green pressed forward, insisting the law must adapt to the threat. This was no social gathering, he announced. This was a meeting of men known to be criminals. His approach would later attract national criticism and legal challenges, but in the immediate aftermath, Green was resolute. He pushed for grand jury proceedings to force the mobsters to explain their presence. When they invoked the Fifth Amendment, as nearly all did, he used their silence as evidence of evasiveness. While attorneys maneuvered and reporters swarmed, the men who had been detained found themselves returning home under a cloud of suspicion, so public that many would never fully recover their reputations. For instance, John Montana of Buffalo, once hailed as a civic leader, philanthropist, and respected businessman, resigned from nearly every public position he held within days. His denials that he had attended the meeting intentionally, and his claim that he had merely stopped to help a friend with car trouble, were rendered laughable by the humiliating detail of his being caught tangled in barbed wire during his attempted escape. The Buffalo press tore into him with headlines that shattered his carefully cultivated image. His political career was effectively obliterated overnight. Elsewhere, the consequences rippled differently. In Cleveland, boss John Scalish, who had been detained after fleeing through the woods and then trying to make an escape by car, immediately reinforced secrecy rules within his organization. In Detroit, Joseph Zerilli, who had managed the cleanest exit by quietly renting a car and slipping away without being detained, found himself forced to explain to subordinates why he had been so close to disaster. In Los Angeles, Frank DeSimone returned home humiliated after being caught in the woods with mud staining his tailored suit, his authority shaken not by legal consequences, but by the ridicule that followed. Newspapers across the country printed unflattering photographs and described the mobsters with language that mixed derision and alarm. Leaders reduced to fugitives, powerful bosses scrambling like frightened men, underworld big shots fleeing through cattails. The myth of mafia invincibility had been punctured in the most public way imaginable. Inside the FBI, internal tensions grew quickly. Hoover was furious that a state police sergeant, one the Bureau had not worked closely with, had exposed a national criminal network that the FBI had refused to publicly acknowledge. Behind closed doors, Hoover chastised his senior officials, asserting that the Bureau must take command of the narrative. FBI field officers around the country were instructed to compile thorough dossiers on every man who had been present, verifying affiliations, businesses, criminal records, and geographic influence. The Bureau framed the effort as a rapid, authoritative response, despite having had much of the information already in scattered field reports that had not been synthesized due to Hoover's long-standing aversion to labeling certain crimes as organized. The Bureau's sudden pivot would eventually produce the first formal FBI reports, acknowledging the structure that investigative journalists and local police had recognized for years: the existence of a national Cosa Nostra. Meanwhile, at the Barbara home, the repercussions were far more personal. Joseph Barbara Sr. was ill, genuinely so, and had heart problems that had worsened through the stress of hosting the meeting and watching it collapse into chaos. Days after the raid, he reportedly told investigators almost nothing of value, maintaining that he was merely entertaining friends and that no meeting had been planned. Despite accounts of him greeting dozens of guests around 8 a.m. and overseeing preparations for a large gathering, he insisted he had been bedridden. His explanation was contradicted by law enforcement witnesses and even by members of his household staff, but Barbara stuck to his story. His health deteriorated rapidly in the following months, and by June 1959, he died at age 52. The estate, once a quiet sanctuary for high-level meetings, became a symbol of the mafia's most humiliating day. The legal aftermath escalated quickly. The men identified at the meeting were summoned to grand juries around the country. Many simply declined to answer questions, invoking the Fifth Amendment repeatedly. Others provided vague explanations. Joseph Bonanno later claimed that he had not been present at all, repeating the unlikely story that he had loaned his driver's license to another man for a trip to Appalachian. But the documentation from the raid, including his social security card and physical identification by multiple officers, contradicted this assertion. His explanation is now dismissed by historians as one of the least convincing alibis offered by any mafia figure involved. In Philadelphia, boss Joe Ida returned home deeply shaken. The meeting had placed him under federal scrutiny for the first time in years. His eventual response was to flee the country. By 1958, Ida left the United States for Italy permanently, yielding leadership of the Philadelphia crime family to Angelo Bruno. That shift would become one of the most consequential transitions in mafia history. Bruno's ascension marked the beginning of a comparatively peaceful era for the Philadelphia organization, though it would end violently decades later. In New Jersey, attendees linked to the De Cavalcanti organization faced a closer examination of their earnings, businesses, and interstate relationships. The fact that two of them, Maiori and LaRusso, had fabricated an elaborate real estate story before slipping into a stranger's car became an anecdote used by prosecutors to illustrate their intent to deceive. Their denials, like nearly all others, served only to deepen the suspicion. In New York City, perhaps the most significant political pressure landed on the Genovese crime family. Vito Genovese had arrived at Appalachian, expecting the meeting to cement his rise as the most powerful mafia leader in America. Instead, he left in a police car, fuming silently, and returned home to a world that suddenly understood he was not merely a behind-the-scenes figure, but a nationally recognized criminal leader. Federal agents increased surveillance on his businesses and associates. The Genovese family's heroin trafficking operations, already under scrutiny, drew intensified investigative attention. Less than a year later, in July 1958, Genovese would be indicted on narcotics charges, a case that many historians believe was at least partially fueled by the heightened attention following Appalachian. If Genovese suffered significant consequences, so too did others in unexpected ways. In Chicago, the outfit had been largely unrepresented at the meeting. a fact that would later be interpreted as a strategic move by Sam Giancana, who maintained a cautious relationship with New York families. The absence shielded Chicago from the immediate fallout, but it also raised eyebrows among federal investigators, who noted that Chicago seemed uniquely insulated from the Appalachian scandal. That insulation would not last forever, but it positioned the outfit differently in the national hierarchy at a moment when other families were under direct scrutiny. One of the most dramatic ironies emerged in the FBI's internal shifts. Hoover, long resistant to acknowledging organized crime as a centralized national entity, had been forced to confront the facts because of headlines he could not control. Within weeks, he authorized a formal, structured program to monitor top mafia leaders, what would become the early framework for the Top Hoodlum program. FBI analysts began charting relationships, leadership structures, geographic territories, and financial operations. The changes were not immediate and not always efficient, but Appalachian had forced the Bureau into a new era. While government agencies scrambled to adapt, public perception of the mafia transformed almost overnight. Before Appalachian, many Americans dismissed the idea of a national crime syndicate as something out of pulp crime magazines or sensationalist tabloids. The notion that dozens of crime bosses would gather in a secluded location to discuss national operations seemed implausible. But the photographs of wealthy, well-dressed men being escorted by troopers, even more so, the images of some having fled through mud and forest, shattered the myth both of mafia invisibility and of invulnerability. Commentators described the raid as the day the underworld was pulled into the sunlight. Others observed that Appalachian exposed not just individual criminals, but the very architecture of American organized crime. Yet for all the spectacle and subsequent political action, historians would later debate an essential question. What exactly had the mafia planned to accomplish at Appalachian, and how close were they to achieving it before Croswell's surveillance disrupted the meeting? Testimony, informant accounts, and the timing of concurrent events provide a reasonably clear picture. The meeting was almost certainly intended to formalize several critical matters. First, it would stabilize leadership after Albert Anastasia's murder, a killing believed to have been orchestrated by Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, and others months earlier. With Anastasia eliminated, the New York power structure had to be recalibrated. Second, business matters, such as the division of narcotics territories, labor racketeering coordination, casino operations in Havana, and interstate gambling concerns, were likely on the agenda. Third, the meeting would address disputes among regional families, Philadelphia, Buffalo, Cleveland, and Los Angeles among them, whose interests intersected increasingly across state lines. These topics were later substantiated by informants like Joseph Valachi, who testified before the U.S. Senate in 1963 that the meeting was to straighten out problems. His testimony, though not always perfect in detail, confirmed that the summit was anything but a social barbecue. The meeting's collapse prevented these discussions from taking place formally, but it did far more than disrupt one day of business. It destabilized long-term relationships among families and exposed rifts that had been quietly widening. Leaders returned home feeling vulnerable, angrier at each other than at law enforcement. Some blamed Barbara for failing to secure the location properly. Others blamed Genovese for insisting on the meeting at such a risky moment in the national climate. Still others believed the meeting was doomed from the start, arguing that too many men traveling to a rural New York estate was inherently suspicious. That sentiment would later lead to new rules. Large-scale national meetings would become rare, held only under extreme necessity, and even then, with far greater secrecy. In the weeks following Appalachian, Joe Barbara's home became an object of fascination, both for journalists and curious residents of the region. Cars drove slowly past the property, visitors hoping to catch a glimpse of the place where the mafia's greatest embarrassment had unfolded. Reporters attempted to interview neighbors, who recounted the shock of seeing troopers swarming the area, the sudden influx of dignified, expensively dressed men running through backyards, and the surreal feeling that their quiet hamlet had become the center of a national scandal. The local reaction oscillated between amusement and disbelief. Many residents had long suspected that Barbara's gatherings were unusual, but few had imagined the scale. Some remembered the whispers from earlier years when large numbers of unfamiliar cars had been seen at the estate. Others recalled rumors that the Barbara bottling plant had unusual connections. But none could have predicted that the property was hosting what amounted to a clandestine national congress of the American mafia. By December 1957, law enforcement agencies had compiled their first comprehensive lists of attendees. The final tally identified 73 confirmed participants, though some historians believe the number may have been slightly higher. The list read like a directory of the American Cosa Nostra's highest ranks: Vito Genovese, Joe Bonanno, Russell Bufalino, Joe Ida, John Scalish, Santos Trafficante, Frank De Simone, Michelle Miranda, Carmine Lombardozzi, Dominic Oliveto, and dozens of others. The concentration of so much leadership in one place offered an unprecedented snapshot of the mafia's national structure. For the first time, the federal government could see, clearly, undeniably, and in one coherent moment, the interconnected web of families operating across multiple states. This visibility changed the future of anti-mafia strategy forever. And still, despite the seismic impact, this was only the beginning. The long-term consequences, the legislative shifts, the dismantling of mob secrecy, the federal awakening, the transformation of law enforcement tactics, the downfall of certain bosses, and the reshaping of the mafia's internal rules would unfold in the coming years. The Appalachian meeting had detonated like a public explosion, but the shockwave had yet to reach its full distance. What began as a police stop on a dead-end road would soon ripple into Senate investigations, new federal crime laws, a permanent shift in FBI strategy, and an irreversible unraveling of the mafia's veil of invisibility. Philip Little Farvel Cohen moved through the underworld like a whisper and a shadow. Small in frame but mighty in influence, he was a man of contradictions, deadly yet discreet, brutal yet business-savvy. His name becomes nearly mythic in the annals of organized crime, not merely because of his reputation for violence, but because he embodied something far more ominous: the intersection of murder, money, and international narcotics. He was not just a hired killer, he was a high-level operator in Murder, Inc., and one of its most trusted lieutenants. Born around 1906 or 1907 in the Russian Empire, Cohen immigrated to New York as a youth, like many who fled poverty and persecution. But his American dream had a darker edge. He gravitated into Brooklyn's tough neighborhoods, where union rackets, street-level protection, and racketeering were as familiar as the tenement wall. Even in his early years, he showed a rare combination of traits: a willingness to commit violence, but also a mind for enterprise, a soldier in the street war, but also a financier in the shadows. Cohen's transformation into Little Farvel came through his relationship with Louis Lepke Buchalter, the leader of a powerful criminal syndicate that would later spawn Murder, Inc. Lepke's organization was ruthless and highly organized. He had muscle, but he also had a vision, a syndicate that crossed ethnic lines, that leveraged legal industries, and most importantly, that understood how to scale violence and profit simultaneously. In that world, Cohen found his niche. He was a killer, yes, but he was more than that. He also managed international drug operations. By the mid-1930s, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, FBN, had identified him, along with his partner, Emmanuel Mendy Weiss, as one of the key traffickers in opium, morphine, and heroin destined for US markets. The FBN would later assert that much of the drug smuggling destined for America was backed by Murder Inc. And Cohen was at the center of that enterprise. The narcotics network Cohen helped run wasn't ragtag. It was methodical, global, dangerous. Opium was imported through European and Asian routes, particularly from China, and shipped in clandestine loads into US ports. From there, the product was refined. Agents once raided an apartment on Seymour Avenue in New York and discovered what looked like an unassuming residential building. Under the floorboards, in hidden rooms, they found a chemical lab, vats, distillation equipment, and traces of morphine. This was not amateur hour. This was a business. Working alongside Cohen was Emanuel Weiss, known in the underworld as Mendy. Weiss had been a trusted enforcer for Lepke since the early 1920s, cutting his teeth in union rackets and garment industry extortion. Over time, he became more than muscle. He became a central figure in both the murder-for-hire operations and the shady financial network of the syndicate. He and Cohen shared both ambition and discretion. Together, they managed the drug trade, braced murders, and protected Lepke's broader empire. Weiss had a cold efficiency. He was tall, imposing, and deadly calm. His reputation was not built on flashy violence, but on results. He was involved in some of the biggest contract killings. The hitting of Dutch Schultz in Newark, for example, was one of his major operations. On October 23, 1935, he and Charles the Bug Workman walked into the Palace Chop House. Weiss, with steely composure, allegedly told the staff to take cover before the gunfire erupted. Schultz and his men were gunned down. Weiss escaped quickly, ordering the getaway driver to speed away. A classic hit, executed with cold, calculated precision. As time passed, the relationship between Cohen and Weiss deepened. Their collaboration wasn't casual, it was institutional. Murder Inc. was not just a killing squad. It was a structure built to protect profit, to eliminate risk, and to maintain the syndicate's power. Cohen and Weiss were essential to that. They organized operations, handled logistics, coordinated with overseas suppliers, and occasionally dealt with witnesses, threats, and betrayals. Their ambitions drew the attention of law enforcement. In 1939, in a dramatic house search, FBN agents uncovered clear evidence of Cohen and Weiss's drug enterprise. They found records, lab equipment, and traces of narcotics in a Brooklyn location. Arrests followed. The indictment wasn't limited to the two men. 5 others were named along with them. Samuel Bernstein, Abe, Little Yiddle Lorber, and Al Angelson among them, all accused of participating in the chemical processing ring. The trial that followed was consequential. By February of 1941, Cohen was convicted on narcotics charges. He was sentenced to between 3 and 10 years, ultimately receiving the maximum 10. Weiss, by that point, was also under heavy legal pressure, though his conviction for narcotics would remain elusive. The FBN maintained that Weiss was deeply involved, but they lacked hard, prosecutable evidence for some charges. Still, his association with Cohen and Murder Inc. made him a public enemy. But the underworld never lets power go quietly. While Cohen was sentenced for drugs, he was also implicated, though never tried, for murder. One of the most notorious unsolved cases connected to him was the double slaying of Danny Fields, also known as Isidore Friedman, and Louis Cohen, on January 28, 1939. Prosecutors believed Cohen may have been one of the shooters, but the case lacked enough reliable evidence to bring charges. In that violent world, silence was often as lethal as a bullet. By 1940s, the pressure on Murder Inc. was mounting. Other kingpins, including Lepke himself, were being arrested, indicted, tried. Weiss, Cohen, and their associates found themselves in legal crosshairs from multiple directions. In one courtroom drama, prosecutors tried to charge them for murder, sometimes using testimony from syndicate insiders who had turned state's evidence. But not every case stuck. While Cohen was serving his drug sentence, Weiss faced another fate. He was indicted for murder, particularly linked to the Rosen killing, the 1936 execution of Joseph Rosen, a former owner who had run afoul of the syndicate. According to informants, Weiss was one of the hitmen. The prosecution presented a case that involved internal syndicate testimony, hit logistics, and the brutal efficiency Murder Inc. was known for. In 1941, both men were in the crosshairs of major trials. Weiss was eventually convicted for Rosen's murder, sentenced to death, and executed. His final words, reportedly, were defiant. He claimed the case against him was framed, and as he awaited the executioner, he insisted on his loyalty to his people and his code. Cohen, meanwhile, survived prison and was eventually released. But freedom did not mean safety. On September 15, 1949, he was found dead on a quiet stretch of Long Island Road. His body bore 4 bullet wounds to the head. In the passenger seat of his car, traces of his blood were found. A classic underworld execution. There was no robbery. Nothing was taken. This was not random, it was definitive. Rumors swirled. Some believed his killing was revenge by those who resented his return. Others said it was a power play, new syndicate leaders eliminating a potential rival. Still, other voices suggested he may have tried to muscle back into operations, pushing out newer players who had grown while he was behind bars. Through all this, Cohen's reputation remained intact among old-timers. He never cooperated with prosecutors or named names. To the end, he was loyal to the code, even if that code demanded his death in return. In the story of Murder Inc., Cohen is critical not just as a killer, but as a builder of its business side. He and Weiss represent the hybrid gangster, part executioner, part businessman. Their operations show that Murder Inc. was more than a death squad. It was deeply involved in narcotics, in extortion, in union influence, running a network that spanned not just New York, but international supply chains. Weiss's execution was a symbol, the fall of the old guard, the crumbling of the violent syndicate that had once seemed unstoppable. Cohen's death was poetic justice, or perhaps tragic inevitability, for a man who wielded power quietly but dangerously, and who operated in the liminal space between murder and commerce. In the end, Philip Little Farvel Cohen remains one of organized crime's most enigmatic figures. He was ruthless but not reckless, criminal but deeply strategic. His life was a mirror of Murder Inc.'s paradoxes, a group built for killing but also for protecting profit, a cabal of hitmen who were also smuggling kingpins, enforcers who understood the value of silence. And with him and Weiss gone, the age of Murder Inc. passed. Their world, violent, profitable, unrepentant, ended, but the blueprint they helped build lived on in the modern structures of organized crime.